Hi, I'm Mike Hutchison, Director of the Museum of the American Printing House for the Blind. Welcome to the Redux presentation of sessions from the Hidden Legacies of Helen Keller Symposium, which was held in Louisville, Kentucky on September 17th and 18th, 2022. The symposium, with primary sponsorship from the American Printing House for the Blind and the Filson Historical Society, brought together scholars, writers, and Keller enthusiasts from across North America. In 2020, the American Foundation for the Blind Helen Keller Archive arrived at our museum on 23 pallets. And since then, our staff has been busy cataloging, describing, measuring, and inventorying this most amazing history of one of the most amazing women of the 19th and 20th centuries. I'm sitting in front of her desk from her house at Arcan Ridge. Helen Keller was a writer, activist, advocate, ambassador, and world traveler who profoundly affected the way the world thinks about people with disabilities. And yet, she is little understood, often frozen in time as a little girl with her hand under the water pump behind her parents' home in Tuscumbia, Alabama. Our symposium was just a beginning effort to bring together the most current scholarship in innovative ways to better understand Keller, her companion Anne Sullivan, and her times. We hope you enjoy the series. Each session will be dedicated to a single speaker from the symposium. Our first session on Saturday morning was titled Curiosity, Pedagogy, and Tools, and looked at the history of education and literacy for people who are blind or deafblind from three very different perspectives. Our first speaker was Dr. Iain Hutchison from the University of Glasgow, Scotland. Dr. Hutchison opened the visitor's book at a school in Edinburgh, Scotland, to understand the small community of teachers of the blind worldwide. He was interested in the teachers, many of whom had very different ideas on best practices. Iain Hutchison is a research affiliate at the University of Glasgow and widely published disability historian. His recent work explores the history of Glasgow's Royal Hospital for Sick Children, the Matrons to Microbes Project, and the RNIB Scotland Seeing Our History project on outdoor blind experience in Edwardian Edinburgh, the Borders, and the Lothians.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can understand my accent. If you're in difficulty, just think Sean Connery and you'll be all right. So, the title of my presentation is A Procession of Elites, Visitors to Edinburgh's Royal Blind School between 1876 and 1948. In 1793, an institution for blind people was established in Edinburgh, Scotland's capital city. It was the first such institution in Scotland and only the second in the United Kingdom. It provided training workshops, notably from its own premises in Nicholson Street, following their purchase in 1806. And with acquisition of a further building, residential accommodation was provided for blind women. In 1836, James Gall opened a school for blind children in Edinburgh, and in 1851, a new blind school opened in the city's Gayfield Square. In the 1870s, this school was absorbed by the Edinburgh Blind Asylum, and so the combined facility with royal patronage became the Royal Blind Institution and School. When the asylum and school joined together, a grand building for the school was inaugurated in the suburb of West Craigmillar, with a ceremony marked by processions and the laying of a formal foundation stone. The slide shows the new building here. Now, I need to turn this round, so it's on your right. And the building that was used in 1806 is on the left. The one on the right is quite a baronial building with towers and everything. The old building is a rather plain two-story building going off the street. Guests in attendance at this ceremony were invited to be the first signatories of a visitor's book introduced for the occasion. Over the years that followed, the visitors' book was regularly produced to callers at the school, which became a showpiece for visitors to Edinburgh. These guests came from other institutions and organisations for people with sensory impairments, but also from elite society from across the world in the course of them making grand circuits of Europe. They came from the professions, from missionary organisations, and from other manifestations of the moneyed classes. The visitors' book was regularly placed before visitors in the years from 1876 until the First World War, and was still occasionally brought out in later years so that it remained in use for over 7 decades. My paper aims to show, through the pages of the visitors' book, how the Royal Blind School in Edinburgh was showcased to a global audience and was indeed sought out by a range of interested parties when they were visiting Scotland's capital. So, the new Royal Blind School was opened on May 22, 1876. The significance of the occasion is indicated by the grand procession that preceded the opening speeches. The directors of the school were driven from the city in carriages, the coachmen wearing blue and white decorative rosettes. They were followed by representatives of trade guilds, by the city bailies, the provost, which is equivalent to a mayor, a detachment of cavalry, bands, a guard of honour, numerous Masonic Lodge members in their regalia, and in pride of place as guests, quote, His Grace, the Lord High Commissioner, the Earl of Galloway, along with his wife, the Countess of Galloway. The procession took a long route through Edinburgh's Georgian New Town. It traversed the Royal Mile that links Edinburgh Castle with the Palace of Holyrood House via the medieval city. And then it continued to the new school built in what was described as a quaint French style and set in spacious gardens and grounds in the eastern suburbs. All along the route from the city, crowds of many thousands lined the streets of Edinburgh to watch the parade. It was a grand occasion, and the signatures of the Countess and Earl of Galloway were the first to be entered in the new book. So the slide here shows those two signatures, rather scrawled handwriting. They had an individual page each, and that set it on motion. They just signed it, for example, as Galloway. People were assumed knew who they were from that, and no formalities like forenames or whatever. Galloway itself is a large rural area in the southwest of Scotland. The Countess and Earl of Galloway, as members of the aristocracy and in the ethos of the time, added prestige to the grand opening of the Royal Blind School. As I will show later, members of the aristocracy were to be periodic visitors to the school in the years ahead. However, in entitling my paper A Procession of Elites, I use the term elites more broadly than linking it only to the landed aristocracy. I look at the comfortably off echelons of wider society who had the time, as well as the inclination, to engage in conspicuous concern and philanthropy. The editor of a magazine, The Bailey, that lauded well-known figures, but also delighted in pointing out their flaws so as to keep them grounded among their lesser mortals, had written in the previous year, 1875. He said, if the philanthropist be poor, it procures him a comfortable livelihood and many a good dinner at the table of the great. While, if he be rich, it gains him a social standing which he would not otherwise possess. The grand opening of the Blind School was an event at which to be seen for a variety of reasons. Personal prestige was part of this. The procession of elites also included those with a professional interest in supporting and directing the lives of blind people in their often held view that people with sight loss were incapable of surviving without their largesse and concern. Therefore, there were visitors from institutions, schools, and societies who catered for not only blind but also deaf people, not least because, for a variety of reasons, these two strands of sensory impairment were often linked. There were visitors who were responsible for administration of poor law provision. In Scotland, poor relief was administered under the terms of the Poor Law Scotland Act of 1845. Inspectors of poor were individually in charge of the destitute of around 1,000 parishes across Scotland, and in addition to aiding the disabled destitute, but not the able-bodied destitute, they sought to take measures to stave off future poor relief applications. For this reason, educating blind children and training them in handicraft trades aimed to make them in adulthood able-bodied and self-supporting. Compulsory education had been introduced in Scotland for children aged from 5 to 13 years of age in 1872. School board members were subsequently also among the people making tours of the blind school, and this slide shows the signatures of an 1895 delegation from Leith, a port town which was close to Edinburgh. You may notice that they are all men. While on the same page there are two lady visitors from Switzerland, a professor of the deaf and dumb from Turkey, a signature in Chinese characters from Wu King Fu in China, but don't be misled by that. There were indeed Chinese visitors to the school, but this particular signatory was not Chinese, he was a Scottish missionary. I think he was showing off a bit. Late Victorian Scotland reflected the age of empire. It was the era of easier communication within Scotland and from England by the now advanced state of railway development, and global communication was also made easier by the growing dominance of steamships over sailing ships. The British imperial context surrounding those visiting the Edinburgh Blind School is very notable in terms of the worldwide procession of visitors, but American visitors are also found, and I will mention two of these later. The first overseas visitors to sign the book was James Scott Hutton from Halifax, Nova Scotia. And this was on August 26, 1878. The slide shows an image of Hutton, who is wearing a suit, a bow tie. I think his suit needs to be ironed, mind you, and he has a beard. He was principal of the Halifax School for the Deaf, a post he was to hold for 34 years. Hutton's comments in the visitor's book were typical of those that were to follow over the succeeding years. He wrote, "Delighted with the situation and the buildings, the admirable arrangements and equipment of the institution, and the evident thoroughness and efficiency of the educational system." A year later, in 1879, the school was visited by its first exotic guest, if I can call him that. The first part of this bilingual entry is in Bengali script. He was Kumar Gajendra Narayan of Kush Bihar, a member of a line of Maharajas. He was followed in 1880 by Elias al-Hawi from Syria, who signed the book in Arabic. And in due course, there were entries in other scripts. One that I particularly like because of its neat calligraphy is that by Lin Chuan Yao from Mukden in Manchuria in 1897. And the slide shows these various signatures in their different scripts. It is apparent that some visitors, with or without professional interest, were what might be called asylum tourists. In 1880, the leader of one party of ladies commented that she had visited similar institutions in England and abroad. Inevitably, she wrote that in none of the others had she seen such perfect order, harmony, and happiness. In 1881, the Reverend R. Henderson of Edinburgh, who had recently lived in Australia, penned a long entry of praise in which he said he had visited blind institutions in many countries. At the Edinburgh Institution, he recorded his pleasure at, quote, the industrial, educational, and religious privileges that it conferred on its pupils. His comments reinforced the agendas of blind organisations of not only providing material aid to blind people or of teaching them to be independent and self-supporting, but also of addressing their added deprivation by being denied access to the Bible. William MacGregor, a Scottish missionary to Amoy in China, saw the school as epitomising laudable outreach that addressed, quote, the thought of what the suffering and helpless owe to Christ and Christianity. In 1886, the first of several pieces of artwork depicting the crests of elites appeared in the Visitor's Book. On August 20, 1886, Queen Victoria graced the blind school with her presence, which, it will be remembered, had royal patronage. The crest is challenging to fully describe, but it consists of a sort of ornamental archway with side panels decorated with the arms of Ireland and Scotland. And below these, it also has motifs of red roses representing England and purple thistles again representing Scotland. In the centre panel are the arms of England and of the monarchy, and in the very centre is the signature of Victoria. This visit took place 2 years before her Golden Jubilee and was the occasion of the Edinburgh International Exhibition of Industry, Science and Art. Visitors came from across Europe, from Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and from Russia's capital city of St. Petersburg in the north. They came from Portugal and Spain in the west, from Italy in the south, and from Turkey in the east. The trail was blazed from across the British Empire, from Canada and Jamaica, from South Africa, from India, Australia, and New Zealand. In the 1880s and 1890s, voyages to Europe from such outposts required time, money, and a strong stomach when the seas were rough. Yet still they came. For example, no less than 14 individuals from Adelaide alone arrived between 1882 and 1915, while there were others from Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Tasmania. In 1888, there were visitors from Montevideo in Uruguay, these being a family of 4 Scots in the course of visiting a family member living in Edinburgh. Other visitors came from Syria, Egypt, and Persia. There were visitors from China and Japan. The Japanese guests, I'll do my best here, the Japanese guests were Konishi Nubuhachi in 1898, Tadasu Yoshimoto in 1909, and Kazo Imanishi in 1911. And the image here shows Konishi Nubuhachi, who again, in the style of the day, is wearing a bow tie and sporting a beard. Now, Konishi Nubuhachi, he was the director of the Tokyo Deaf and Dumb School. Some of the visitors were returning expatriates who had spent many years overseas as missionaries, teachers of deaf and blind children, imperial civil servants, and so on. Natives of country of origin ranged from members of Russian royalty to participants in the European civilizing mission who were disciples of the missionaries who had taught them tactile communication, sign language, and of course, the true religion as they saw it. Preceding widespread popularity of Braille, the Moon system of tactile print had been adapted to an extensive range of diverse language systems, and of course much of its output was biblical in nature. The image here shows effectively an advert of availability of material in Moon. It includes Danish, Dutch, Irish, Armenian, Arabic, Mandarin, and Tamil. Just a few of the examples that are quoted here, but there was well over 100. The first visitors from the USA were Mrs. F.M. Tower, accompanied by her daughters Sarah and Florence. And here the slide shows their entries. They came from Bridgeport, Connecticut in 1882, signed their names, but did not add any comment about their tour of the school. Some American visitors identified affiliations with blind and deaf institutions. The Tower family did not. Did they have any connection with the Connecticut Institute for the Blind? Sarah was around 18 years of age at this time, and her father was a clergyman, but that's all I have on them. Perhaps someone here knows today. One example declaring an affiliation with an institution is Hannah Babcock, who arrived with Mrs. William B. Waite in 1903. They signed themselves as representing the School for the Blind, New York City. Babcock was a teacher of music to blind students at the New York Institute for Special Education. William B. Waite was the school superintendent and Hannah Babcock's uncle. She and her uncle increasingly published material in print for teaching music to blind students, and this material was disseminated across the USA through the American Printing House for the Blind. The last entry in the book was by Queen Mary, wife of King George V, on November 8, 1948. And here her signature is shown. She just signs it simply as Mary, and her image wearing a tiara, lots of jewellery around her neck. Say it's a simple signature accompanied by the date. There's none of the fancy artwork that was inserted around earlier visits by royalty such as Queen Victoria in 1886 and by members of the aristocracy. The book had not been presented to a visitor to sign for 12 years on the day that Mary called by. Consequently, we only have to go 2 pages earlier to find entries made on June 20, 1932. Da-da. In 1932, Helen Keller had an honorary degree of Doctor of Laws conferred upon her by the University of Glasgow. This being facilitated by Dr. James Kerr Love, who for many years had been medical superintendent of the Glasgow Deaf and Dumb Institution. He had been in correspondence with Keller for nearly 3 decades and was Keller's host for much of her 1932 visit. The next slide here shows Kerr Love standing with Helen Keller as Helen Keller reads his features while he stands patiently as the process is done. I think that was for the benefit of the photographer. The other slide shows the graduation hall at the University of Glasgow, which is the location she would have attended and is still in use. Love aided Keller in recording her 1932 tour in her book entitled Helen Keller in Scotland. It is a book of 3 parts. Firstly, there is Love's introduction, in which he describes his many years of association with Helen Keller. Then there's Keller's narrative of her travels in Scotland and England, which she titled My Pilgrimage. And finally, taking up the bulk of the book, there are transcriptions of her correspondence and speeches related to her visit. In her book, Keller mentions on the very first page of her narrative visiting the blind schools and deaf schools in both Glasgow and Edinburgh. Her visit to the Edinburgh Blind School was only 5 days after her graduation ceremony in Bute Hall at the University of Glasgow, for which teachers of deaf and blind pupils had presented her with her ceremonial robes. She was accompanied on her 1932 travels by Anne Sullivan, who was now Anne Macy. And I've lost a page. Where is it? Here we go. And also by her secretary, Polly Thompson. Polly Thompson was a native of Scotland, and her brother, the Reverend R.J. Thompson, was at that time the minister of St Bride's Kirk Church, located in Bothwell, then a rural community a few miles from Glasgow. It followed that Polly wished to visit family during the tour, and this resulted in Keller addressing a packed congregation in St Bride's. I grew up in this locality and know St Bride's Kirk, where it dominates the centre of Bothwell village. It has a history that goes back to the late 14th century, being founded in 1398, and its antiquity was not lost on Keller. Opposite the title page of Helen Keller in Scotland, there is a photograph of her in her doctoral robes posing at St Bride's Kirk. The soft sandstone masonry of the old kirk has endured the intervening years well, probably better than I have. Here's the same location. Following a visit to England in July 1932, Keller returned to Scotland, including to Edinburgh. As she toured in August 1932, she narrates her journey, sometimes quite descriptively. Unfortunately, despite the early mention of Edinburgh's Blind School on the first page of my pilgrimage, Edinburgh Blind School, nor indeed the other schools visited, are really not part of the description of her wider tour. In the letter section of the book, she does mention being presented with a book of Scottish verse at the Edinburgh Blind School. I wondered if this book had survived in the Disability History Museum, but it's challenging because, Mike's had a look, but I think the title given to the book in my pilgrimage is inaccurate, so we don't really know what we're looking for. Okay. I'm sure that some of you will, at some time or other, have been a dinner guest of friends when perhaps at the end of a sociable evening they have brought out a visitor's book and invited you to sign your name and add a comment. You're not going to criticise the host's house decor or choice of attire for the evening, or write that the steak was too tough. So it was with the Royal Blind School Visitors Book. This source does not offer critical insight to the blind school in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. It's not that kind of resource. But what it does offer is an insight to the activities of members of wealthy society who like to see themselves and be seen as compassionate, concerned members of the elite. That interest is perhaps a type of voyeurism, conveyed with a sense of pity towards young blind people, whether they sought pity or not. There's no mention in the visitor's book comments of signatories actually conversing or engaging directly with the school's blind students. Elite visitors were obviously people who had time in great abundance, and this is especially seen in the large numbers who called on the school as part of itineraries that involved lengthy commitments of time, whether they came from England, Europe, far-flung outposts of the British Empire, from the USA, or from other parts of the world. Those who had a professional interest in Edinburgh's Blind School, such as superintendents or directors of institutions for people who were sensory impaired, enjoyed professional appointments that could accommodate lengthy and expensive study tours, ostensibly to further the exchange of knowledge surrounding institutional approaches to sensory impairment. the Royal Blind School, located in Scotland's capital city, was very much at the centre of this global outreach. In 2012, I attended a conference entitled Disability and the Victorians. Here I met Fred Reid, a retired academic historian who had lost his sight at the age of 14. Consequently, in the early 1950s, he had been a pupil at the Royal Blind School in Edinburgh. He was later to write his personal experiences of being a resident at the school during a formative period of his life. In his professional career, he had become well aware of the ethos that operated for much of the 20th century in educating blind children. What had been presented as cutting-edge educational provision in the Victorian era seemed, in Fred's view, to have changed little in post-World War II Scotland. The superintendent of the school from 1905 to 1932, which was the year of Keller's visit, was a man called William Stone, who very much carried forward the Victorian ethos throughout his tenure. His successors endeavoured to introduce practices that were more forward-thinking, but that did not extend to young people's interpersonal relationships. Here you see an image of Fred and his wife Etta, and also the book, a bit of plugging here, in which he wrote up his thoughts and experiences. Fred recalled the perpetual surveillance of pupils by what he called the sex police, and also young people's ploys to evade their attention. In this respect, Fred argues that blind young people at the school were still living under the shadow of William Stone in what he called the Stone Age. So, by the 1950s, some things were changing, but others were not. Fred had no recollection of elite visitors arriving to survey the school in patronising wonderment. He recalled a post-war environment that would explode in the following decade into the swinging 60s, but where, at the blind school, there was no understanding of young people's emotions, needs, and aspirations. Or was it the opposite? Was the school only too aware of young people's emotions, needs, and aspirations, and they recoiled in trepidation? Perhaps that had always been the case. But as we know, the days of the residential institutional model for delivering education to young blind people was changing. Fred wrote about his very personal experiences in his contribution to Disability and the Victorians, and which I had the pleasure of editing along with Martin Atherton and J. Verdi. Titled The Panopticon, Towards an Intimate History of Special Schools for the Blind, Fred's chapter is a very personal account of the insider experience of a residential blind school, in this case the Royal Blind School of Edinburgh. Today, the grand edifice of the Victorian Royal Blind School no longer echoes to the sound of the voices of young people chanting mathematical tables or running free in the recreation ground. It has now been converted to residential accommodation for city executives. The Stone Age has come to an end, and so has my presentation. I'll be pleased to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.